You are looking live, ladies and gentlemen. Those are the words of the great Brett Musburger, who saw a lot during his tenure as a pro football and college football commentator. One of the men that he called games for, Jeff George. And we're going to be talking a lot about him today. The former number one overall pick had a wild and chaotic career, but threw probably the prettiest deep ball of all time. We're going to discuss his tenure with the 1999 Vikings, why it happened, and why it ended. Stay tuned. We're going to have some fun tonight.
Welcome to the Real Forno Show. Tyler Forness, contributor at NBC'S Sports Edge, USA Today's Vikings Wire, Sports Illustrated's All Seahawks, along with being a member at Climbing the Pocket.
That is the epitome of watching Jeff George in the National Football League. You really need a drink to soak it all in. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to have some fun here tonight. I'm your host, Tyler Forness. With me, as always, the man, producer Dave. That's the second week in a row I've gotten the point right. We're flying high. Dave, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Couldn't be better.
Well, we could be better because the Vikings could have a Super Bowl. That's why, as your shirt says, this team makes me drink.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have some fun because the 1999 season is quite an interesting one in that it feels like a letdown, but at the same time, it rebounded in a major way. And the catalyst of that rebound is the one and only Jeff George. And in order to really understand Jeff George, you have to go all the way back to his college days and him getting drafted into the NFL. At Illinois, Jeff George was fantastic. He led the Fighting Illini, I believe, to a Rose Bowl. He had just a howitzer of an arm, a piss missile. Jeff George has arguably a top 10 arm in the history of the National Football League. He threw an absolutely beautiful football. Gorgeous. There were some deep balls in that 99 season that never left the camera, and it was just perfect. Just perfect. And that was why he kept getting opportunities in the NFL. But there were some issues that kind of clouded him at Illinois. And then when he got to the NFL as the first overall pick in 1990 for the Indianapolis Colts, things never really got off the ground, Dave. They were pretty rough for him.
They sometimes don't for first teams.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he really struggled with the Indianapolis Colts. He did end up having a winning season, 1992, but he refused to report to training camp in 93. And then after 93, the Colts traded him to the Atlanta Falcons. And what was really impressive about that trade, they got a first-round pick back for him. A guy who had issues, who threatened to hold out for training camp before the 1993 season. And Irsay had to threaten with him with a fine in order to get him to show up. Then he ended up going to the Falcons starting in 94. This is where things kind of went off the rail for George. And I think this is really important to talk about in the context of him as a Minnesota Viking, because everything plays into it. You know what, G-Mac? I like that. I've got the hair. Dave's got the beard. You combine us together, we are pure Norsk. I dig it. I am actually not having the best hair day. I got kind of lazy this morning. Whatever. I manage a liquor store. It's fine. They don't care. They love me. All right, so let's talk about his time in 1990 in the 90s with the Falcons. All right, he led them to the playoffs in 1995, but the real thing that everybody knows him for is all the BS, all the whining, the tantrums, the immaturity. And I even kind of made a joke in our group chat that I was just going to whine, complain, and throw stuff around in my office just to really epitomize Jeff George. because I feel like you have to understand that piece because it plays such a pivotal factor into his lack of success in the National Football League on a grand scheme of things. Jeff George finished with nearly 30,000 yards in his NFL career because teams kept giving him chances because of that beautiful, beautiful arm. Search Jeff George highlights on YouTube if you ever want to go down that rabbit hole. It's fun. He's incredible, but there's a reason why he didn't catch up. So the biggest reason, and Dave, I think you're going to remember this, in a game against the Eagles in the end of September on TNT, who, if you don't remember, had half of the Sunday night contract with to air Sunday Night Football. Had the first half of the season, and then the second half of the season went to ESPN. Yes, that was very new. He got into a heated argument with June Jones, and it was caught on national TV, and Jeff George is just all stoic and just yelling at him, like, and it got him suspended. And at the end of his tenure after the 1996 season, so he only lasted 3 years after getting a first-round pick for him, the Indianapolis did. He ended up going to the Oakland Raiders, where he had some of those issues in Oakland, but it's also Oakland, and they really don't care. They are going to be really calm, cool, collective, and they're just going to, you know what, you got talent, we'll take you. They've been known to do that pretty much since the existence of the franchise, and this is the epitome of that. But they hired John Gruden after the 1997 season, where Jeff George was pretty good. And the problem was, even though he threw 29 touchdowns and 9 picks, for an impressive 91.2 passer rating, the Raiders finished 4-12. They ended up replacing their head coach, which I believe at the time was Art Shell, and they implemented it was Joe Bugle. I stand corrected. They implemented John Gruden, who instead of running a vertical passing offense, ran more of a controlled timing West Coast approach, which really did not suit Jeff George. Very inconsistent there. And then they ended up getting Rich Gannon, which ended up being one of the best free agent quarterback signings in the history of the National Football League, as Gannon was finally figuring it out and won an MVP for the Raiders and took them to the Super Bowl. That leads to the Minnesota Vikings.
Former Viking Rich Gannon. Yes.
Dave, take a drink. There we go. What's the bourbon on tap tonight?
It's not. It's Tres Agaves.
Ooh, Tres Agaves is good.
Mm-hmm.
High recommend, Dave. Revel Tequila Reposado.
Mm-hmm.
You're gonna want to try that because it's a really good Reposado tequila with a bourbon finish because it's a 70% aged oak. High recommend. Very unique.
Well, you're talking about tequila and bourbon. I was watching my guys, Rex and got his Daniel, and from the local whiskey group here, Whiskey Tribe, and they were talking about a bourbon that's aged in tequila barrels. A unique bourbon.
What's that one called?
I didn't write it down. I will have to go look at that video again. But it sounded unique and sounded interesting. I'll let you know. And as most people know, Tyler runs a liquor store. Dave does not run a liquor store, but he appreciates liquor. After many, many decades of drinking it, back in my crew chief days all the way up till now, I appreciate fine spirits. And you can get them at Tyler's store anytime. And we like talking about it on occasion.
Yes, we do. Speaking of, if you ever find a bottle of the Weller Antique Collection, DM me for my address. I've been desperate to find one. Anyways, let's kind of talk about the antithesis of him joining the Vikings. The Vikings traded Brad Johnson away after the 98 season for a first and a third round pick in 99 and a second round pick in 2000. Getting a first, second, and third for Brad freaking Johnson was quite the coup. And fortunately, they were able to capitalize on that 11th overall pick because they really blew the 28th overall pick by selecting Demetrius Underwood. That one hurt. But they were able to score a franchise quarterback in Dante Culpepper, who, if you've ever listened to me on this show before, know how much I love Dante Culpepper and think he is massively underappreciated by this Vikings fan base.
And 99 was his rookie year.
Yep. But he came from Central Florida. And back then, the group of 5 teams really didn't play a lot of great competition. It wasn't nearly the same college football landscape as it is today. Even though he set NCAA records for completion percentage, and he had an absolute cannon for an arm, he needed some time to sit and learn. And he was afforded that time because you had Randall Cunningham coming back after winning 14 games before going into the playoffs. Cunningham was viewed as the starting quarterback, and they thought they had a couple more years left with him, but they knew they needed to find that next guy. In 98 was considered a very rich quarterback draft. Unfortunately, only 2 of those guys really worked out. Donovan McNabb, who went 2nd overall to the Eagles, and Culpepper, because Tim Couch at 1 didn't do much. Akili Smith at 3 was one of those athletic quarterbacks, as people like to talk. He was very good at running the football. He was great on the move, but he needed to really develop that passing. He never really got there to a substantial level. And it doesn't help that he was with the Cincinnati Bengals, who were a dumpster fire franchise. And then Cade McNown, who went 12th overall to the Bears. They tried this thing where every 3rd or 4th series was Cade McNown. Didn't work, and then he got the full reins. He was bad. Who do I like better?
Like most Chicago quarterbacks.
Yeah. Moon or Dante? Chris Thompson says it best. Look at my wall, man. Look, I had a framed Dante Culpepper jersey. It was beat up. I ended up selling it because I didn't have space for it. And I'm looking to get another one and then get that one framed up and get it looking just as nice as these. Will it be in the office? Probably not, but this is a Warren Moon wall. And eventually I'm going to have a 3rd Warren Moon jersey back there. And it's going to be the Washington Huskies. So that'll be really cool. But the reason why they ended up signing Jeff George was because of Brad Johnson. And 6 games into the season, it was just evident that Cunningham was done. Mm-hmm. I believe Judd said it a couple weeks ago on the show, Judd or Dave. Man, my brain is just so fried. I keep just stumbling over my own words. He mentioned that I believe Cunningham went up to Green and said, "Hey, I'm done. I just have nothing left." And then in comes Jeff George, who kind of leads a renaissance, because at that point the Vikings were 2-4, and that's not exactly what you would call a good record.
And when Cunningham did it, it was in the middle of the 6th game. They swapped at halftime. Yes. It was at half that Cunningham told Coach Green, "I'm done."
Mm-hmm. And the kind of way things went, it was a very frustrating opening 6 games because the Vikings had 4 losses by 5-4, 2-2. They weren't exactly losing barn burners here. They weren't getting blown out. They were losing close games. They did avenge that Atlanta Falcons loss in the 98 championship game, week 1, 17-14. But who gives a crap? It's the next year. It doesn't mean anything. But it did feel good to gain a modicum of revenge. And then close losses to the Raiders at home, and then the Packers on the road. They got the Bucks at home before losing to the Bears, and then that aforementioned game that Dave talked about, the Lions. They ended up losing that game 25-23. But at halftime, it was 19-0. And I think, if I remember correctly, Dave, I'm going to look up the play-by-play because this might be the game that drove me bonkers as a kid.
Which one?
Yeah.
The Broncos?
No, this game, Jason Hansen, the Lions, had a game-winning field goal where there was a penalty right before he missed the first kick and hit the second one. I think this might have been the game because there was a delay of game penalty on Jason Hansen, and then he hit the 48-yard field goal. I have never forgotten that. Like, that was one of the more frustrating losses because we weren't able to decline it.
Right.
Like, so very frustrating loss. But from that point on, it ended up being a renaissance, as I mentioned earlier, for the Vikings, because the next week they had the Niners and they whipped them 40-16 in somewhat of a coming out party for this offense. They racked up almost 400 yards on the San Francisco 49ers, and they ran them out of the Metrodome. Like, you had Jeff George just slinging the ball around, 250 yards, 3 touchdowns, and interception. And this was when, like, Jeff Garcia ended up starting because Steve Young was injured. And this was at the very end of Steve Young's career. Fun fact of this game: Lawrence Phillips was on the 49ers, the often troubled star from Nebraska who ended up getting drafted in the top 5 by the Rams and ended up dying in prison because, I believe, murder. Just a really, really rough go for him. But they ended up kind of taking care of business. And I'll tell you, like, Randy Moss didn't do a whole lot, but he didn't need to. Chris Carter, Jake Reed kind of handled things. Matthew Hatchett had 2 for 88 and a touchdown. They did some great things in order to kind of just get this going. And get it going they did. What was really impressive is right after the Niners got a scoop and score, 80-yard touchdown to Matthew Hatchett. Pretty cool. Jeff George just kind of stood in there and kind of took care of business. And then throughout the course of the season, they went 8-2. They went on a quick 5-game winning streak to get to 7-4 before losing back-to-back to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who they would not win a game at Raymond James Stadium from 1998 until 2014, when Anthony Barr got that scoop and score to get them their first win at Tampa Bay since before Raymond James was built. And then most people remember the Kansas City game because Randy Moss, that was his only punt return touchdown, and that ended up taking the lead. It tied the game at 28, and then Kansas City drove for the game-winning field goal. But then they won their final 3 in the regular season. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, I think they won the division. Or, no, they didn't win the division. They got the top wild card because Tampa Bay won the division.
Right.
They
but they were
the Cowboys.
The top wild card, and they hosted the first game once we get to the wild card playoff against Dallas.
Yep. And they beat Dallas, and then
they whooped Dallas.
They really did. It was a game that was much further apart than the 27-10 score indicated. But then they went into the greatest show on turf and kind of got lambasted. But
no.
I remember that game.
That game was exciting because you had the 98 Vikings who set all sorts of offensive scoring records.
Yeah.
Versus the 1999 St. Louis Rams, who are now setting all sorts of scoring records. And the whole philosophy is who gets the ball last wins, because they were scoring on almost every single drive. Defense was an afterthought for both teams during this game. It was an exciting game to watch. It's one of the reasons the NFL has gone to a more offensive-friendly set of rules. Besides putting skirts on quarterbacks, they want more offensive productions because they like the fact that if you got teams, and take last year for an example, when you had the Chiefs and the Bengals, right? I think it was the game where you go back. Team with the last, gets the ball last, wins, right? And that game against St. Louis, back then was that sort of a game. Did we pull it out?
Yeah.
No. Unfortunately, no. But up until that point in NFL history, you had not seen that sort of offensive philosophy performed by two teams going at it. It just wasn't what. I mean, the game plan back then was hand off the ball, run the ball, hand off the ball, run the ball, hand off the ball, run the ball. Right? That was football back then. Well, you take Dennis Green and the Vikings, and you take, and I'm forgetting the coach, I should know it.
Dick Vermeil.
Dick Vermeil for St. Louis, and suddenly it's, oh, forget this. This is fireworks. We're going downfield. We're going to open this puppy up. And we did. And it was an exciting game to watch. Do I wish the Vikings win? Hell yes. Of course I did. But it was one of the most entertaining playoff games we have seen in decades. Still to this day. I would say last year's game that, went down into overtime and the whole deal was just as exciting. But it was Buffalo and Kansas City. But this one was the forerunner to that. This whole season and this whole attitude on how to play offensive football didn't materialize for another 15 years or so. But it finally has, and I'm happy it has. And the Vikings were the forerunner in 98, and then again in 99 when they got somebody with a gun for an arm.
Well, I'll say this. I remember that game quite a bit differently than you, Dave. And I remember the first half being incredibly exciting. And the Vikings ended up putting up a lot of points, but a lot of that ended up being in garbage time because they were up 17-14 at half, and then they found themselves down 49-17. So as a Vikings fan, that was a very frustrating game to watch at the back
that third quarter where the defense couldn't stop squat. And we're talking defensive guys like Chris Dolman on the team, right? That defense was not weak whatsoever. And Dwayne Rudd at linebacker, right? But then that fourth quarter when, granted the Rams scored 2 more touchdowns, but the Vikings scored 3 more, and you were waiting for them to score more and more and more. So the third quarter that killed us. It was like a premonition of, Mike Zimmer in the last 2 minutes type thing. For the
Rams, the Rams unfortunately had 35 consecutive points before the Vikings were able to get 20 on the board to finish the game. Very frustrating end, but some of the moments throughout the course of the season, and it was brought during doing some of my research today. I was kind of reminded of it. George didn't have there's kind of a meme going around on Twitter. Didn't have that dog in him, and kind of what that means is he didn't have that little bit extra. He didn't have that want. Remember Cam Newton 2015 in the Super Bowl when the ball was on the ground? He didn't die for it, and he just got ripped mercilessly. That was Jeff George. He didn't, when things didn't go his way, they went wrong. He didn't give 100% to try and remedy the situation. Jason Whitlock, who gets a lot of flack for a lot of reasons, was an ESPN columnist at the time and said, I was at the Vikings-Rams playoff game when George didn't dive to the ground for a loose football. Then that's just the kind of guy Jeff George was. He didn't want to put in that little extra effort because it didn't necessarily suit him in a certain way. And he had all the arm talent in the world, but mentally he was just not, either he wasn't or he didn't want to be capable enough to truly be that elite alpha. And one of the greatest that's ever played.
Favre. He may have had the arm talent of Brett Favre, but he wasn't Brett Favre. Brett Favre would die for that sucker.
It almost felt like watching Jeff George, Dave. He was an incredibly talented player that just didn't love football. And a lot of Minnesotans might remember the name Neil Broughton on the 1980 Olympic champions. Wayne Gretzky once called him the most talented player he'd ever seen. he just never tried and never cared enough to try. And I feel like that's kind of Jeff George. Inherently talented, brilliant passer, never really wanted to put in that little bit extra in order to be great. And he wanted to come back, and it sounded like he was okay backing up Dante Culpepper. Just be like, hey, I'm willing to come back as a backup. I know this is Dante's team. I like it here. Dennis Green said, see ya. And I think a lot of it had to do with just his attitude, his track record, because in Minnesota, he really didn't have any issues. He got along well with the coaching staff, the team, and it felt like he was actually finding a home. And if Vikings hadn't drafted Dante Culpepper in 99, there's a chance that Jeff George could have been this team's long-term option with the offense that they had crafted, with the weapons that they had on the outside.
How many years had he played before he played for the Vikings? It was quite a few. He'd already been in the league for a while.
Was that was his 10th season. He was drafted in 1990. But we also know that Dennis Green had no problem cycling in and out veteran quarterbacks. He didn't care. And Jeff George at the time was 33. We're not talking about somebody who was old. We're not talking about somebody who was increpid. We're talking about a guy who was honestly probably still in his prime with his limited amount of reps in comparison to other quarterbacks of his era.
Didn't he go to DC after that?
He did. He got a big contract with DC. I believe it was 5 years, $25 million. Yeah. So here's what Wikipedia said. George hoped to return to Minnesota as the starting quarterback, but was told by Dennis Green to shop around. After attempting to speak to other teams, he was eventually offered a 1-year, $400,000 contract by Minnesota with incentives up to 1.4. But rather than sign, he signed a 4-year, $14.8 million deal with Washington's Brad Johnson's backup, which is hilarious to think about today, that he basically signed a starting quarterback contract with the Washington football team when they had literally just spent the farm the year before to trade for Brad Johnson. But it was also the sign of a different era, Dave, because you needed a capable backup quarterback. Because you weren't expecting your quarterback to play every single game. And that was the tough part.
Yeah, because they didn't put on skirts on quarterbacks back then.
No. I really like that you say that. That's absolutely hilarious.
It's the way it is.
Because it's true. It's true. They are protected in ways that players at other positions just have not been. And
now,
they are
in the NFL's defense, in the long term, it's quarterbacks that bring money to stadiums for the most part. It's the quarterback who's, the face of the team, and they want quarterbacks to stay healthy, play well, so that brings in eyeballs, viewers, people buying seats, butts and seats, buying, $20 beers, $15 hot dogs, buying jerseys, the whole works, right? And that they're doing it for a business sense. And there's some logic behind that. I mean, I like it, but there's some logic behind it.
Yeah. So, kind of when encompassing the time with Jeff George, I think it can be really remembered, Dave, for two reasons. One, God, what a deep ball he threw to Randy Moss, man. That football was some next level stuff. And I kind of talked about it with Dave pre-show. The ball did not leave the screen. You see my hand right here? It how it's still in the shot. That was a Jeff George deep ball. It never left the camera. And we weren't even talking HD. We were talking standard definition, sometimes full screen, not even widescreen. George was a special, in the words of Chris Sims, thrower of the football.
He could literally throw a football through a wall. I hadn't seen an arm that strong. He could air it out at easily 75 yards.
Oh, yeah. Easily 75 yards. And just do it just breathing. The 1999 season did land Jeff George the AP Comeback Player of the Year award because the prior year he had only completed 55% of his 169 passes for 1,100 yards, like 4 touchdowns, 5 picks. He did just a little better than that with the Vikings, 58.1% completion percentage, which was fine in that era. 2,816 yards, 23 touchdowns, 12 picks, and a really nice quarterback rating as well, 94.2, which was one of the highest in the league. Like Jeff George ended up making this team fun. He ended up kind of continuing that 3 deep mantra, which we developed with Randall Cunningham, and then obviously Jake Reed, Randy Moss, Chris Carter. Matthew Hatchett was no slouch himself. Jeff George was a really big reason why that there was sustained success, and especially Dennis Green coming off of that 15-1 season where he entered the year on the hot seat. To continue that level of success, even with the turmoil at the quarterback position, I believe was really important, and Jeff George kind of prolonged Dennis Green's career.
Purple Haze, we talk about these influential seasons, the almost seasons, the could have been seasons, because that's all we've got as Vikings fans. Since 1961, we've come so close on numerous occasions. Be it the 4 Super Bowls, be it the umpteen, I don't know if it's umpteen, but multiple NFC championships. The great season here that ended up against the Rams, even though I don't think that was a NFC championship. I think it was a division game.
Divisional.
It was still the best game of that postseason. And it's all we got. But it's going to make, it's got to make, once the Vikings finally win that Super Bowl, make it all the sweeter because of how close we've gotten.
Oh, 100%. And this is where content right now kind of stinks, like just for us. Look, could we be giving you the same old lines about Kirk Cousins? Like, Kirk Cousins is bad. Kirk Cousins is good. Here's why he's bad and good. Like, sure. But at the end of the day, do you really want to spend the next 6 weeks talking about Kirk Cousins? I don't. Like, let's have some fun. Let's reminisce. Let's remember some of the underappreciated moments and times in the history of the Vikings. And that I think we've done a good job so far. 97 was a really big one. Jeff George's season, Percy Harvin last week. Like, there's some fun stuff that we can talk about in Vikings history. And there's some stuff I have down or in my bank that we can go to that I just don't know enough about that I want to research. But it is a very busy time for the liquor store, graduation season, 4th of July. So we're kind of relying on some stuff that we know and that I'm very, very familiar with. And Jeff George is one of them. He was a very, very fun quarterback to watch. He did put on a good show, but it was that 99 game, Dave. We talked about it. It was a tale of two teams. In the first, second, and fourth quarter, the Vikings looked like they belonged. In the third quarter, they looked like the 1995 Philadelphia Eagles with Rich Kotite as head coach. They just couldn't do anything. And that's kind of Jeff George in a nutshell. You never really knew what you were going to get with him. And the team kind of ended up encompassing that when it mattered the most. They just kind of forgot who they were and struggled. I'm going to have to go back and rewatch that game because just from a neutral perspective, because I remember the game itself being really entertaining from a neutral standpoint because it was high scoring. It was high octane. You had multiple 40-plus yard touchdowns.
And you saw the comeback effort in the fourth quarter. It was, but it was the third quarter, and it was the defense. That's where Denny, earned his nickname of Any Green, right? Because he had no D. That's the game where it came out. So it's good.
Yeah, 100%.
But we've done 98. We skipped Percy Harvin. Now we did 99. We know 2000 was a heck of a season. So it'll be coming up shortly. Sometime
My
soon.
boy. Look, I honestly don't know, Dave, if I can do another show about me just raving about Dante Culpepper without annoying the fan base. But let me tell you that 2000 season, oh,
It just wasn't Dante, though. That whole team was stacked.
Mm-hmm.
From Corey Stringer to the offensive line. God, they were monsters. And, you had a great defense. Dolman. You had, trying to remember who else. You had
Randall, Hovan.
Yeah, Randall, Hovan. You got all sorts of folks that are out there. That was a miraculous season. And we will save it. It'll be, I don't know if it's going to be next week, but it'll be one of the weeks coming up. So.
Mm-hmm. So, like, I'm just kind of looking at this 2000 season kind of as we talk about it. The Vikings were 11-2, and then they lost their last 3 games that ended up costing them home field advantage throughout the playoffs, which, as we know, the New York Giants ended up 41 donut. And if they end up getting home field throughout the playoffs, like, I don't know if you remember this, Dave, but there's a conspiracy theory out there that the Giants had hacked the Vikings communication and knew every play that was being called. And Robert Griffith, what I believe was the catalyst of it, because he's like, there's just no way that they knew everything. Like, they knew what we were doing before we did it every play. We were a better football team.
I bite my lip.
Mm-hmm.
I've been told things about that game from specific individuals. And yes, that conspiracy theory was true.
Well, we will talk about that more off the show. We'll kind of wrap this up here, guys. I'll throw it to you. If you have any questions about the Vikings, about kind of this show in general, kind of fire them in the comments. Let's spend the last 15, 20 minutes, if we go that long, having a good conversation, because the Jeff George era of the Vikings was kind of a short one, and there was some stuff to get into, but really the biggest story coming out of 99 was Randy Moss squirting the water bottle at the ref in that playoff game. And I kind of think about, like, I wonder how much Jeff George played into that. Just
what?
Not necessarily
rubbing off on Randy. Randy had a similar attitude, so
yeah, pretty much. But it's never a good thing to have 2 guys with that kind of attitude that are just loose cannons that can explode at any time.
Yeah.
Who was the 4th wide receiver? It was Matthew Hatchett. Matthew Hatchett was the 4th wide receiver in both 98 and 99. He was a 7th round pick in the 1997 NFL draft and had a relatively good career for the Minnesota Vikings. I believe he got hurt in the 2000 season, which really kind of ended his career. Never really got off the ground after that. But Matthew Hatch is one of my all-time favorite Vikings. He was just a really solid option for the team. And especially with 97's wide receiver 3 being team favorite Chris Walsh. Walsh just was never that good. He was never really good enough to be a consistent receiver. But let me tell you,
he's a good special teamer.
Amazing special teamer. That's a guy you would consider for, like, Hall of Fame special teamers, because he was fantastic.
ISM, hey, Purple Haze, I hope he turns into something that quality. He has the potential.
If ISM could turn into a wide receiver 3, that's a win.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we can't be expecting greatness. Stephon Diggs was an anomaly. He was a 5-star recruit across the board. He was like a top 5 wide receiver recruit over the last 15 years. He just kept dealing with injuries at his hometown school, Maryland, and ended up falling because of that. And obviously the quote unquote attitude, but the attitude, who cares? Like, the guy has a little bit of diva in him. If you're a receiver and you don't have diva, I don't want you. You want the ball.
Oh, I got the want the ball. Chris asked a good question, though. What team in the last 10 years reminds you the most of the 1999 in terms of personnel and success?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Of the Vikings, the only one that comes close is 2017.
Chris, if you're talking teams that don't necessarily, it doesn't have to necessarily be the Vikings. That really intrigues me. I would actually lean 2021 Buffalo Bills. Really solid depth, good offensive line, really, really good weapons, a quarterback that can sling it a country mile, players on all three levels of the defense, but the defense just couldn't hold up. Like the 2021 Bills, I think, is a good comparison. All right. Let's see. I think, is Steve asking a question?
No, he's commenting on,
No.
he's beating the Zimmer horse.
Oh, we can beat the Zimmer horse. KC 2-3 years ago is a good one. Yeah, that I think the Bills are a more balanced football team.
Hey, Donnie.
Yeah, just because their defense is better. There's just more talent on the defense from top to bottom. And I think a lot of Kansas City's success on defense was specifically linked to Steve Spagnuolo calling a very great aggressive style, and it not necessarily has to do anything with his players. So I think just in terms of that, that's how I view it. Yeah, Anthony Bass and Waswasser. Don't forget, Northwestern State great Kenny Wright was on those teams too. Gosh, Kenny Wright just getting roasted every 5 seconds drove me up a damn wall. And Robert Tate, the drafted wide receiver from North Carolina who turned into a corner, and he actually wasn't too bad, but he was with those other guys and kind of just got lumped in with them. But Tate ended up being a nice little reclamation project. Early 2010 Steelers.
They were good.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
They had a good
I'm going to be really...
Roethlisberger. Yeah. They had some good wide receivers.
They've always had good wide receivers. It's not fair, man.
Hey, I go back to the days of Lynn Swann and Stallworth. Not Stallworth. Yeah.
Even in the 90s, like Andre Hastings, Yancey Thigpen, / Cordell Stewart, that Super Bowl team. Like they've had good receivers throughout the course of my life.
Steve, the conspiracy theory over the Giants 41-0 is that the Giants were monitoring all the radio traffic of the Vikings from the booth to the sideline to the quarterback, all that stuff. And that was back in the days before the NFL encrypted the radios for each team. It was that game in particular that caused the NFL to encrypt the radios, the frequencies on both sides of the ball. And if you notice, it was that next year, because of that game, even though the NFL didn't come out and say it was because of that game, that they did that. The Giants knew the calls ahead of time, and they were relaying them down because they were listening to the Vikings radio traffic. That's why you used to be able to go in. I don't know if a lot of you, at least years ago, I don't know if they do it now. I think now you got to pay for it and you only get a certain frequency, but you can buy a headset during a NASCAR race to listen to a certain team and to listen to their stuff as they're talking to their driver. Well, it used to be you could buy a certain set of headsets or have a scanner and you could listen to it in the crowd and you could pick up the radio signals. The Giants were doing that before that was a thing in NASCAR. They did that against the Vikings. They were listening to all the calls. They knew that, hey, the defense is lining up in cover 2, all right, and they'd tell it, and then they would call the play or run the alternate play ahead of time to defeat it. And it was cheating, and the Giants got away with it. It's that simple.
They did, and very frustrating from a Vikings perspective. But it kind of is what it is. I'm really surprised that's not
Purple
really talked
Haze, that
about
was
more.
way before Bluetooth.
Oh yeah, this is a good one from Andrew. Um, who would you want from that team to play for the Vikings now? Not Randy Moss. Oh, that's easy. It's one of two guys. It's either John Randall or Randall McDaniel. Because
Mm-hmm.
Randall McDaniel is one of those rare offensive guards that can really shape an offensive line just by his presence.
Him and
He was
Hutch.
that
Yep.
good.
Mm-hmm.
Best comparisons for what his impact was in today's game: Quentin Nelson and Zach Martin. They're just on a different level. The positional value does not matter for those players. He's just special. I also would have considered Corey Stringer because he was tremendous before his untimely passing before the 2001 season. Um, I'll tell you, Dennis Green had a lot of flaws. He was obsessed with building in the trenches. Absolutely obsessed. Just his first rounders. Randall McDaniel wasn't his, but
Sorry.
Chris, I want you to look in your drawer in your kitchen, find the nearest spatula, and you know what to do with it. Okay. But
Chris Hovan was nice, but Chris Hovan, believe it or not, was not all the greatest.
he was good.
He was
They
okay.
wanted him to be the Randall replacement, and it just never came to fruition. Stalin Collinet, Dwayne Alexander, Tony Williams, those three guys that were drafted in the first couple rounds in the mid 90s, none of them ever panned out. Dwayne Clemens, same way. Just it just is what it is. But they tried, and they tried diligently to continue to build in the trenches. Randall McDaniel, first round pick. Todd Stussy, first round pick. Corey Stringer, first round pick. They kept going to that well with Dennis Green because he believed that was how you won football games and won championships. And they made a couple runs where they had opportunities to do that. And Jeff Christie, I believe, was undrafted. And then you had Matt Burke, who was drafted in the 6th round of 1998 to take over at someday at center because they were going to have to deal with cap concerns after 99. And it ended up playing out pretty nicely. Matt Burke had a fringe Hall of Fame career.
Well, Christie and Burke both were outstanding centers.
Yeah. I'll say this because there's a comment about dealing with the Ravens defense in 2000. The Vikings would have had more success than the Giants against that Ravens defense. The Giants offense was not that great. It was Kerry Collins, Amani Toomer, Ike Hilliard, go Gators. But you had Tiki Barber, you had Ron Dane. Like, there were some good players. It was not a great offense. The Vikings had a great offense. I think they would have had a lot of struggles, but I also think that they would have had more success because of who they were. So I don't necessarily think that the Vikings would have had an issue playing the Ravens. Robert Smith was a first-round draft pick. I believe he was the first rounder after a Herschel Walker trade in 1993 out of the Ohio State University. I want to say like pick 19 overall. That sounds about right. Smith, great player. To this day, I believe he's the only player in NFL history to have his first and last name on his jersey at the same time. It had Robert up top and then Smith right below it in bigger letters. I'll never forget that. To me, it was just the weirdest thing in the world. I can't remember what year it was, but I remember it vividly in my head.
And he is a smart individual.
Yes. Ended up
retired early.
He retired early to go to medical school.
Mm-hmm. And I think he's a doctor.
Yes, he is. He also was a college football analyst for ESPN.
Mm-hmm.
And he was on ESPN.
Well, he still does
News.
It every once in a while.
Yeah. He did the ESPN News broadcasts where it was basically just like a running Sports Center gimmick. And yeah, he was a dang dang good analyst. Very, like you said, smart person.
Mm-hmm.
Smart person.
And
that's why he left the
his
game
style, once we got Adrian Peterson after that, the styles were totally different. Oh, yeah. Robert Smith was a very, very heady back. He would sit there and he'd wait for his blocks to develop, and he'd bide his time, and he'd find a hole and he'd squirt through and he'd go. Whereas Adrian, especially when Adrian first got in, Adrian was just like, ball, goal line, go. And he'd run through anything that was in the way, and it didn't matter. And the styles were totally, totally different. Mm-hmm. But you knew on Robert Smith, just like with Adrian, just like with Dalvin Cook now, any play, it could be any play. It could look like, oh, he's got the ball, he hits the line, he's held up, it may go for 2 yards, and then bang, he's gone.
Yeah. Just a special guy. I came across a video of Robert Smith the other day where he was running at Three Rivers Stadium in Pittsburgh and literally ran out of his shoe and ran 30 yards without his right shoe for a touchdown. Like, the guy was special. All right, well, Dave, good show. This was a lot of fun talking about Jeff George and the chaos, and now I have to throw something. There we go. We have officially Jeff Georged. Dave, next week we'll discuss. I should have a show ready to go. I'm going to be out of town this weekend. 4th of July, ladies and gentlemen, there will be no show. I will be spending 4th of July with the family, and I hope all of you do the same. But we will be back in July with some. We're probably going to start shifting towards preview, and we're going to start talking about training camp, and probably
we still don't have dates yet, right?
Nope. It'll be the end of June.
End of July. Yeah.
We'll probably do a week talking about offense, a week talking about defense, kind of previewing what we're going to be looking for, what we want to see.
Special teams.
Dave, I'm going to need you to spend 15 minutes talking about our long snapper.
Hey, can do. Easy.
All right. Dave, what do we have coming up on the network this week?
This week we have the boys on Wednesday. Vikings happy hour. We have Matt and Ryan themselves. They were out at Chad Graff's charitable golf tournament this week. Mm-hmm. So, not only were they working on their golf games, which is probably pretty pathetic, they were drinking Lake Monster beers, as in that picture, but they were talking football and getting insights, because everybody that reports on the Vikings that swings a golf club was there. So, I'm sure they were comparing notes and having a great time. They will be here.
Except for me. I was not there, unfortunately.
They will be here Wednesday with Vikings happy hour. And from there, we have 2 old bloggers, Darren and myself, will break down another 3 themes this week. I don't know what it is yet, but we'll find out in depth, break it down. We're curious how you liked last week. I thought we did a pretty good job, and we'll keep that going until 2 old bloggers turns into your pregame show.
Yeah, and we're really excited for it to turn into the pregame show.
Yeah,
so that means Vikings football is back. It's going to be a fun time. In the meantime, thank you for joining us here tonight and letting us turn your Monday purple. And as always, Skol Vikings!
Skol Vikings! Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell, and rate us on your favorite aggregator. And a special shout out goes to our partners, The Daily Norseman, where the best Vikings content can be found, and to Lake Monster Brewing, home of the best beer in Minnesota. Skol, everybody.